afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you. I'm Teresa Pierno, President and CEO of the National Parks Conservation Association. And you are on a Zoom webinar today, so your cameras and microphones are turned off to preserve the bandwidth for our presenters. Please make sure to submit your questions to our Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll have time for your questions near the end of today's presentation. So thank you again for joining us today to hear about what I and so many others believe is the largest threat facing our national parks. I want to extend a personal thank you to Dr. Patrick Gonzalez for joining us today. Dr. Gonzalez is the principal climate change scientist at the National Park Service. He studies the causes and effects of climate change on our national parks, work that is critical right now as we work to protect and preserve them. And you'll hear today, his research shows us that national parks and their nearby communities are disproportionately impacted from climate change, serving as the canary in the coal mine for what we could see across the country and around the world. For his steadfast leadership and unwavering support of our parks, NPCA was so proud to award Patrick with the Stephen T. Mather Award last year. Congratulations and thank you again. I myself have 2 children, 5 wonderful grandchildren, and I spend as much time as I can exploring with them our outdoors and national parks. I've been introducing them to them kind of slowly, but 2 years ago, my children and grandchildren, Jack, Ryan, Bennett, and Tella, and Esme, joined my husband and I in Yellowstone National Park. That experience opened up a whole new world to them. They got to see geysers and mud pots and bison, large bison. They were shocked by the size of the bison. It really was incredible. And that's an experience I want not only for them, but for their grandchildren and for all of our grandchildren. But for that to be possible for future generations, to be able to experience these parks the way that we've been able to, we have some hard work ahead of us. Last year, I spoke at the Yale School of the Environment. I challenged the distinguished alumni, those brilliant scientists and researchers and conservationists and environmental leaders to speak up, to not only publish their research, but then advocate for what they learned that could turn the tide. But you don't have to be a scientist from Yale to have a voice and make a difference. We all have a voice. We can all make a difference in this enormous fight against climate change. So as you hear today's presentation, I challenge each of you to think about how you can speak up for our national parks that are facing oil and gas drilling at their borders, for our parks that are suffering the effects of regional haze because states aren't being held accountable, and for our parks that are safe havens for threatened and endangered species. Because we know when we do speak up, we can truly make a difference. And the future for our national parks, our grandchildren's and our grandchildren's grandchildren deserve nothing less. So thank you once again for being with us today. And now I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Ryan Valdez, NPCA's Distinguished Director of Conservation Science Policy. And I should also mention a scientist from Yale who is using his background to speak up for our national parks. And we are so grateful for his work. Take it away, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And congratulations to you, Patrick, on receiving the 2019 NPCA Stephen Mather Award. As the Director of Conservation Science and Policy at NPCA and on behalf of science at NPCA, it's really a great pleasure for us to host Dr. Gonzalez among our extended family on this Park Talk. And with a growing need to empower our park advocacy with the best available climate change science, it really is a pleasure to have with us a top expert on the issue. So allow me to just tell you a little bit about Dr. Gonzalez. He's a long-serving member of the U.S. National Park Service and holds the distinguished title of Principal Climate Change Scientist. He's also a faculty member at the University of California, Berkeley, and also a member of that university's Institute for Parks, People, and Biodiversity. He conducts applied research on the impacts of human-caused climate change and on ecosystem carbon solutions. His work requires that he connects with various agencies, organizations, many individuals in the research realm, and he does so to get the climate change science into natural resource management where it's needed. So now, in addition to his impressive field work, his academic work, and all those research credentials, it's really what he chooses to do with that vast knowledge and experience that is most important here. And this is where he's really gone beyond the call of duty. And this is why he has our Mather Award, is because he educates our policymakers, our decision makers on how to protect our national parks from their most imminent threat. It is a great honor to introduce a real champion in the conservation community, a man who joins us all in caring very deeply about the future of our national parks. So please welcome Dr. Patrick Gonzalez.
Thank you to the National Parks Conservation Association and to Ryan and Ms. Pierno for this high honor of the Mather Award. I greatly appreciate this tremendous recognition of my scientific research on human-caused climate change and my strong stand for scientific integrity. Thank you to the National Parks Conservation Association for your vital work to protect our national parks and for making a difference on climate change. Okay. Yosemite Valley. On a Christmas morning, 33 years ago, I woke up on the floor of Yosemite Valley, and stepping out of my tent was like stepping into an Ansel Adams photograph. The brilliant white of the snow, the silver of the granite walls, and the dark black canopy of the ponderosa pine trees. Since then, however, scientific research that includes data from Yosemite has shown how so many aspects of that scene have changed in just 30 years. The hotter temperatures of climate change have melted snowpack, increased wildfire, and shifted plant and animal species upslope. Now, today I will show you the science of climate change in US national parks and solutions for the future in these 5 sections. I draw my scientific information from these published sources, and NPCA will be posting the links on the presentation page afterwards. The human cause of climate change is an important scientific fact because it points us to the solution. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has risen to its highest level in the atmosphere in 800,000 years, far above any natural variation in geologic time. Cars, power plants, deforestation, and other human sources pump over 11 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year, while forests, soils, and oceans can only naturally remove 6 billion tons. The remainder, 5 billion tons, goes up into the atmosphere and accumulates. This is the fundamental imbalance that causes climate change. The increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has intensified the greenhouse effect and increased temperatures to their hottest level in 800 years. Analyses of all potential causal factors have determined that human activities have caused 98% of the measured increased heating of climate change. All credible scientists agree on this fact, the human cause of climate change. This increased heat, in effect, is equivalent to burning one 100-watt light bulb over every square meter of the earth at the height of a tall person, day and night, every day, continuously, every day of the year. Now, colleagues and I analyzed for the first time the magnitude and spatial patterns of climate change across all of the national parks, and our results revealed that human-caused climate change since 1895 has disproportionately exposed the US national parks to increased heat and aridity. This map shows the temperature trend in the national parks for the last century, and it shows that temperature in the parks increased at double the national rate. Here's the Park Service here, and here's the rate for the 50 United States and territories. This disproportional exposure to increased heat in the parks is because parks are located in, or much of the area of the national parks is located in extreme environments at high mountain elevations and up in the Arctic. Climate change has heated the area of the 421 US national parks 1.1 degrees since 1895. Now, 1.1 degrees might not sound like a lot, but 1 degree Celsius, which is about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, is the equivalent of pushing a mountain down 170 meters, or about 550 feet, the height of the Washington Monument, from cooler areas up above to warmer areas below. Our results also revealed that the national parks have been experiencing disproportionate decreases in precipitation, rainfall, and snowfall compared to the country as a whole. And this is because much of the national park area is located in extreme arid places, the arid Southwest, and in this region of Alaska that has experienced decreases in precipitation historically. Now I'm going to show you a series of cases across national parks that use scientific data from the national parks in analyses that go through these two scientific procedures of detection and attribution, and so tie the impact to human-caused climate change. In Bandelier National Monument and across the southwestern US, the increased heat of climate change has combined with low points in the natural precipitation cycle to cause a drought since 2000 that is the most severe since the 1500s. This is Muir Glacier in Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska in 1941. Now, if you can see my cursor, the arrow there, look at the, follow the top of the glacier against the mountain there. And 63 years later, this is Muir Glacier, or the area that was Muir Glacier down below. 1941, 2004. Climate change has melted 640 meters of ice of Muir Glacier at its lowest extent. That's 2,100 feet, or more than the height of one World Trade Center. And this is one of 168,000 glaciers that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has used to determine that human-caused climate change is melting glaciers globally. Wildfire is a natural and necessary part of many forest and woodland ecosystems, but climate change is intensifying the heat that drives wildfire and has doubled the area burned by wildfire across the Western US over natural levels, including the rim fire here, which burned up into Yosemite National Park. In Rocky Mountain National Park and across the Western US, climate change has doubled tree mortality since 1955 through drought, wildfire, and bark beetle infestations. And we can see that, mortality, tree death has increased in the interior West, the Pacific Northwest, and most in California forests. In Yosemite National Park, climate change has shifted subalpine forest upslope into subalpine meadows since the 1800s. And this is in an area where temperature has been increasing at more than the global average. In Noatak National Preserve in Alaska, climate change has shifted boreal forest northward onto formerly treeless tundra. These shifts in Yosemite and in Noatak are major vegetation shifts, biome shifts, and a change in climate that can shift the biome of an ecosystem is a major shift because it changes many different species. In Mojave National Preserve, Death Valley National Park, and Joshua Tree National Park, climate change reduced bird species richness 40% since the early 1900s. And this is because the increased aridity outpaced the ability of birds like the black-throated sparrow to cope. In Sleeping Bear Dunes, National Lakeshore, and across the United States, climate change shifted winter bird abundances 30 kilometers north since 1975 and led to widespread extirpation of this bird, the evening grosbeak. Climate change, by melting glaciers and by causing the expansion of water, which expands when it warms, has raised sea level around the world. In Golden Gate National Recreation Area, climate change has raised sea level about halfway to your knee since 1854. And in the national capital, parks, climate change has raised sea level about the same amount in almost half the time here in the tidal basin right by the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. You recall that climate change is essentially an input of energy into the Earth system that's equivalent to hanging a light bulb over every single square meter of the Earth, burning continuously day and night. 90% of that increased energy goes into the oceans. And so in Channel Islands National Park and in other coastal national parks, climate change has been warming ocean waters at a greater rate than the air temperature. The increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere dissolves in water and forms a weak carbonic acid. So climate change has also been acidifying ocean waters, and acidity in the Pacific Ocean off Cabrillo National Monument in San Diego has increased 40% since pre-industrial times, 1750. In the National Park of American Samoa and across tropical coral reefs around the world, climate change has killed the living part of extensive areas of coral, leaving the inorganic white part, and so bleaching tropical coral reefs around the world. So those were all historical impacts. And now I'm going to show you future risks. With no emissions reductions, the worst case scenario, climate change could raise global temperature to its highest level in 50 million years. Okay, this analysis ended at the 2005 temperature, which is right here, if you can see my cursor. And without emissions reductions, global temperature could follow this red path, which would be higher, possibly higher than any other time in 50 million years. If we meet the Paris Agreement goals, temperature would increase, but not nearly as much. It would follow this blue line here, and it would increase, but it would not nearly be as drastic, and would save us from the most drastic consequences of climate change. Now, that analysis that you saw previously, colleagues and I also downscaled the climate projections for the 50 United States and territories with individual analyses for each of the national parks. And this is the worst case scenario, and it could result in temperature increases up to 9 degrees Celsius or 16 degrees Fahrenheit in national parks in Alaska. That's the bad news. The good news is that cutting emissions, this green line here, could also cut projected increases in heat by 2/3. So sustained action by all of us could avert that worst case. These are the precipitation projections across the country. And we see projections of decreases in precipitation in the Southwest and South Central US, the Everglades, and the Caribbean, with increases for the rest of the country. In Yellowstone National Park, climate change could increase fire frequency an astounding 300 to 1,000% by the end of the century. Climate change could melt all of the glaciers from Glacier National Park in Montana. In Grand Canyon National Park, climate change could reduce Colorado River flow up to half by mid-century. Climate change could cause sea level rise that could inundate up to half of Everglades National Park. These by the end of the century. These are the blue areas here. In Channel Islands National Park, climate change exposes archaeological sites to more damage from erosion, from sea level rise here, or from more intense storms and regular runoff upland here. Joshua trees. Climate change increases the risk of losing almost all the Joshua trees from Joshua Tree National Park under the highest emissions scenario. And in Yosemite National Park, again, and across Southwest US forests, climate change increases the risks of tree deaths up to 50%. Colleagues and I have analyzed the potential risks of major vegetation shifts, biome shifts around the world, and analyses for the US National Park area. And we found that the combination of climate change and land cover change from the expansion of agriculture and urban areas puts 1/5 of US national park land at high risk of vegetation biome shifts. Like here in Bandelier National Monument, a shift from pinon juniper woodland to grassland or bare arid lands. Colleagues and I have also analyzed the risks globally and in US national parks to to increases in invasive species. And we also found that, that climate change and land cover change put 1/8 of US national park land at high risk of invasive species, including these Japanese knotweed in Melvin Hazen Parkway in Rock Creek Park, Washington, DC. The roofer red knot and 3 other animal species in US national parks are listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act due to climate change, due specifically to climate change. In Lassen Volcanic National Park, pikas are at risk of local disappearance as their habitat shifts off the top of mountains. In Joshua Tree National Park, the desert tortoise is at risk of increasing aridity and could perhaps lose 2/3 to 9/10 of its habitat. In Rock Creek Park and Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historical Park and Prince William Forest Park, climate change may increase aridity and reduce stream habitat up to half for salamanders in the 3 parks. In Lake Clark National Park in Alaska, climate change puts salmon at risk by increasing water temperatures at that critical time of salmon spawning. Adaptation is our measures to adjust resource management to help protect biological diversity and ecosystem function under climate change. In Joshua Tree National Park, the park has used the science which has identified potential refugia. And you see in the lower left here, the map of potential refugia from Lynn Sweet and colleagues from the University of California, Riverside. And what they've done is identified those refugia. They're monitoring them closely, as you see Nick Graver doing here. They protect them especially from wildfire and concentrate invasive species removal in those areas, and also route trails around them to minimize trampling of young Joshua trees. And the fire protection is very critical because one of the potential risks of climate change is that it seems to be increasing invasive species. And this means an increase in red brome in desert areas, which has allowed fires to spread in Joshua trees areas where fires had not previously burned. Colleagues and I have developed an innovative method to integrate climate change data into the identification of new conservation lands for adding to the national park system and to other federal lands. And this innovative method of integrating climate change with other conventional selection criteria could advance lasting conservation and contribute to this international goal of the United Nations of increasing protection to 30% of land by 2030. And in Sequoia National Park, proactive fire management, prescribed burning, and letting natural fires burn in wilderness can reduce the risks of high severity crown fires. Finally, the fundamental solution to all of the impacts and risks of climate change is cutting carbon emissions from human activities. The national parks actually have a natural carbon solution. The national parks in California conserve forests or ecosystems with the highest amount of carbon per square on the land, carbon density, up to 2,600 tons per hectare. This is up to 10 times Amazon rainforest. So protecting redwood, coast redwood forest in Redwood National Park and Muir Woods National Park contributes to reducing climate change, a natural carbon solution. And colleagues and I analyzed for the first time the carbon in ecosystems across the state of California. And we found that the 27 national parks in California whole contain 42 million tons of carbon. And that's equivalent to 1 year of emissions from everybody in Los Angeles, Miami, Kansas City, all of those cities there, 7 million Americans. Now, that might sound like a lot. It is 7 million Americans and all their carbon, but it's not a lot. It's only 1 year. So in 1 year, 7 million Americans can burn the equivalent of all the carbon in the coast redwoods and the sequoias and the Joshua trees and all of the vegetation in the US national parks in California. So this points to the major solution, and that's reducing carbon emissions from fossil fuel burning. The natural carbon solutions are insufficient. And even if the current administration is denying science and blocking action on climate change, the 24 states and Puerto Rico of the US Climate Alliance have banded together and pledged to meet the Paris Agreement goals. They have together cut greenhouse gas emissions 16% since 2005 and are on track to meeting the Paris Agreement goals through renewable energy, energy efficiency, and energy conservation. The state of California has cut its greenhouse gas emissions 14% and achieved this goal of reducing emissions to 1990 levels 4 years early through renewable energy like this solar panel at Lassen Volcanic National Park. And again, energy efficiency, energy conservation. In Golden Gate National Recreation Area, this solar panel on the roof of Alcatraz and other sustainable actions cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 1/3. And then the national park went and calculated, as you can see here, calculated the remaining emissions and funded carbon offsets offsite in a dairy farm through methane capture. And in funding that, they reduced emissions offsite equivalent to what they were emitting on site. And so that offset their emissions and they went carbon neutral. Golden Gate National Recreation Area went carbon neutral. Now these were all centered on transforming the energy system, which is essential for reducing climate change. Another essential action is transforming the personal transportation sector. And you can see here the great benefits of walking, transit, public transit, and biking. Will you be a part of those 3 sustainable groups of people? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has evaluated the range of carbon emissions reduction technologies and practices and concluded that it is still possible to meet the Paris Agreement goals of limiting heating to less than 2 degrees Celsius or 4 degrees Fahrenheit. It's still possible with concerted global action. These actions would produce very real conservation benefits. And foremost among these is reducing the risks of plant and animal extinctions by 2/3 below the high emission scenario. So reducing carbon emissions could help save wildlife and plant animals and plants in national parks. So I'd like to encourage you, in conclusion, to take personal action on climate change. I live a car-free life, and you can either get rid of your car like I have, or just use it part-time, walk, bike, install or buy renewable energy, these other sustainable and simple practices. And by taking personal action on climate change, you can help avoid the most drastic consequences for our national parks. Billions and billions of small actions created the problem of climate change. So billions and billions of sustainable actions, however small, can help solve the problem of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. That was an incredible presentation. We are so grateful to the work that you are doing to help us understand the climate science behind the impacts we are seeing unfold in national parks. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Mark Wensler, the Senior Vice President for Conservation at NPCA. And my colleague, Ani Kameanui, and I are going to spend about the next 10 minutes or so drawing the connection between the climate science you just heard about and climate action. And following that, we'll have time for Q&A. I'm glad to see that people are actively using the Q&A box. I've tried to answer a few questions, but we will come back to that in a moment. So that we will get underway. So I want to talk about, how science really drives the work that we do at NPCA. It was in 2006 when we first established a climate change program at NPCA. And the first thing we did, we recognized that we had to analyze the science to see what it was telling us about climate change impacts in national parks. Our first report, with the help of some climate scientists, showed us many of the things that you just heard about now from Patrick, that we're experiencing hotter air and water temperatures, more wildfires, more floods, some extremely concerning impacts. Unfortunately, those impacts have only grown worse since we did that report in 2006. Our 2019 report, Polluted Parks, showed that 80% of national parks are under significant threat of change from climate change, and damages are still unfolding. So science is often the wake-up call for us. It's a call to action, much in the way that Rachel Carson's 1962 Silent Spring was a call to action for us to address the threats of pesticides and other environmental damages. The work that Patrick and others are doing today is a wake-up call for us. In fact, just 2 years ago, the National Park Service put out a report on sea level rise and storm surge, flooding that will happen throughout coastal areas by 2100 if we fail to reduce climate pollution. Now, if this isn't a wake-up call, seeing half of the National Mall flooded, I don't know what is. Unfortunately, scientists who are really doing this work, this hard work, and telling us what the impacts are often under a great deal of pressure. We know that Maria Caffrey, who was the lead author on the sea level rise report, was forced to resign her position after complaining about political interference in the study. We know that Dr. Gonzalez received a cease and desist order from the Department of Interior after speaking out publicly and testifying in Congress about the impacts of climate change on national parks. We know that Dr. Gonzalez was also put under pressure to minimize the impact of humans on climate change in his published research. He refused to do either one of those things. Dr. Gonzalez has published his research unchanged, and he has continued to speak up on behalf of national parks and speak up on behalf of addressing climate change, as we all just so eloquently heard now. In fact, this is the reason, the main reason, that NPCA is so honored to give Dr. Gonzalez our 2020 Mather Award. Named for the first director of the National Park Service, NPCA gives this award annually to an employee of the National Park Service who goes above and beyond and resists political pressure and takes risks to protect park resources. And we can't think of a better recipient this year than Dr. Gonzalez for all the work he is doing. So when it comes to taking action on climate change, really for NPCA, that means two things. It means addressing the causes of climate change and addressing the effects. We know undisputably, as Dr. Gonzalez has told us, as 100% of climate scientists are telling us, that human-caused emissions are driving climate change. So we must reduce pollution. We've had programs in NPCA for the last decade and a half focusing on reducing power plant pollution, oil and gas pollution. We are going to double down on that work. It's more important than ever that we bring those emissions down. But we also must address the effects of climate change. I saw a few comments in the Q&A about climate refugia, about biome shifts. You know, these things are happening now. It is too late, unfortunately, to stop climate change. We see the impacts unfolding around us, as Dr. Gonzalez demonstrated. But we can take steps to help parks be more resilient. We can look at where wildlife need to move in a climate scenario and make sure that they have open pathways to move into new areas, to make sure they have the habitat they need, that national park wildlife can remain resilient. We can do things like restoring ecosystems, because we know ecosystems that have all the water they need, they have all the vegetation they need, are going to be more resilient in the face of climate change. So these are the things that we can do. These are the things that we must do and that we are committed to doing. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Ani Kameyanui, who is the Deputy Vice President of our Government Affairs Department, to talk about some of the opportunities we have ahead of us, specifically to address climate change impacts on national parks.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mark. So Mark has framed NPCA's history and our investment in the science alongside Dr. Gonzalez's robust portfolio on the science impacts and potential solutions to climate impacts on our national parks. My job is to, in a very short time, share a little bit more about what NPCA is doing to dig in and give you a handful of examples of that work. What we know is that the problem is big. The good news is we also know what the policy solutions are to this huge problem. To achieve those solutions, we need to do three things. The first thing we need to do is start by telling the park stories, where they've been, where they are, and where they're headed without intervention, which Dr. Gonzalez and Mark have done very well. And what our job to do in the policy sector at NPCA and as advocates is to use those stories in the halls of Congress and with the administration and with our communities so that it's clear why we need to do these next two things, which include, first of all, developing resilient and adaptable park landscapes. So for NPCA, this means engaging in a handful of resilient campaigns. For one, it is 30 by 30, establishing 30% of our nation's lands and waters into protection by 2030. This means protecting big natural landscapes like that of Gates of the Arctic in Alaska, protecting it from major mining projects along Ambler Road that would disrupt a huge migratory corridor for caribou, excuse me. It also means protecting and restoring and continuing our work in the Everglades, as we've heard about earlier. And it means protecting cultural landscapes like in the Deep South and the Mississippi Delta, talking about the Great Migration and other civil rights narratives. It also means changing our relationships with tribal communities and improving those relationships in campaigns like our work around Badger 2 Medicine just outside Glacier National Park in Montana. The second component of resilient and adaptable park landscapes includes increasing our coastal resilience. That means everything from restoring coastal reefs in our Florida national parks, and you saw that slide from Dr. Gonzalez with the bleached coral reefs, but also looking at climate-fueled natural disaster impacts and how they affect everything from those natural resources to our cultural resources. We see archives underwater. How do we ensure the National Park Service has the resources they need to protect these amazing cultural and historic artifacts? And one more example for developing resilient and adaptable park landscapes includes figuring out how to ensure wildlife migration is protected. That for NPCA means supporting transportation legislation that provides funding for wildlife overpasses in some of our nation's busiest park highways. It also means protecting and preserving the genetics and the legal protections for endangered wildlife so that they can roam farther and more freely, like this grizzly you see in the bottom left. The second important piece of our advocacy includes reforming our energy systems and mitigation, slowing down those greenhouse gas pollutants. So we know that greenhouse gases are a huge part of the problem. They're hurting our national parks, as evidenced by the details that Dr. Gonzalez shared. We also, luckily, know what those sources are for greenhouse gases and where they come from. And therefore, it's NPCA's job to really throw our weight behind the rules, safeguards, and industry changes and the politics that help get us to a cleaner future. So for NPCA, this means ensuring things like the Clean Air Act is being fully utilized to its greatest extent possible to protect parks and their air quality. I noticed a question about air quality with emission standards, control requirements, and meeting the naysayers who refuse to do this in court. It also means modernizing the rules and regulations that govern fossil fuel development on public lands. That includes ambitious but very appropriate policy on lease royalties, cleaning up old wells, and more. And doing all of this mitigation work really requires us to do it in a manner that is just and equitable. Establishing a cleaner energy democracy requires balancing the scales of impacts that have been far too heavily burdening people of color, communities of color, and fossil fuel dependent communities. So in sum, we all have a role, and what is good for parks is also good for public health and the economy in the face of climate change. Patrick gave you a number of examples of things we can do as individual citizens, and I hope we provided a couple of examples of what we can do institutionally and through federal policy to improve things for you and me, as well as for our national parks. The beauty of national parks is that they represent a terrific segment of our democracy. They are a shared treasure that have shared benefits that hopefully represent American culture. Ideally, saving them from climate change also means saving ourselves. So what we hope is that you'll help NPCA and help Patrick get us there and take action on climate. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Mark to help us answer a number of your questions. And thanks again for joining all of us.
Thank you, Ani. And if Patrick and Ryan could join us back on the screen, and Teresa, thank you. We've had some really robust conversations going on in the Q&A box, and so we won't be able to get to all of them, but we will do the best we can. I had responded to a couple questions, but it turns out I just learned that the participants cannot see the answers. So I'll just quickly respond to two of those. Randy Fisher, you asked about other emissions besides carbon dioxide that we need to address as major contributors to climate change. And absolutely, at NPCA, I think Ani talked a bit about oil and gas and methane emissions. That is an area that we are increasingly focused on. Couldn't agree more that we need to address all of the greenhouse gases. HFCs and black carbon have not really been a focus for us yet, but I think we are, as Ani said, we are doubling down on going after emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. I think we need to learn more about some of those other sources, and we will commit to do that. Second question we had from Bill Hewitt. Hello, Bill. Wanting to know about whether educating park visitors, has an effect in dealing with climate change. And Patrick and I were just talking the other day about a project we worked on. I think the last time we worked together, at least 5 or 6 years ago, was a National Science Foundation project looking at how you can engage park visitors and educate them about climate change. And what we found, and we can send the report around later, is that people who come visit parks already inherently care about them and want to see them protected. And so it's an ideal time and place to engage them in a conversation about climate change and engage them in solutions. What we found was that people who experience climate education in that kind of a setting in a beautiful national park, the kind of scene that Patrick painted about Yosemite when he first started speaking, they care more and they're more likely to act. And so let me turn to you, Patrick, if you have any other reflections on that last point, since that's something that we worked on together.
Yes, you expressed it very well. The national parks provide wonderful setting for awe and for appreciation and for motivating you and everybody to take action.
Thank you. So I want to turn to a few other questions. We've had a number of people asking about, aside from advocating for legislative changes in international accords like the Paris Agreement, what can we as individuals do to make a difference? Patrick, you went through some of those. I'm wondering if other folks have thoughts on that, either some of the things that we're doing at NPCA to motivate change, some of the things that we're doing organizationally. I know Teresa has led an initiative to green up NPCA. So I think we're thinking about all of those things. So anybody want to take that question?
I'll just first say, Mark, that I emphasized personal transportation and living a car-free life like me, because for average Americans, that could automatically reduce your emissions 15 to 30%, depending on the other aspects of your lifestyle. So it's a major part of every American's carbon emissions.
Thank you, Patrick. We had another question about the impact on national parks of air pollution, especially in the Western parks. How is that affecting the flora and fauna of those parks? Are there any sort of, how is that compounding what we're seeing with climate change? So looking at air pollution specifically, what do you see happening? Patrick, if you would like to take that one, if that's come up in your research.
I'm trying to look actually again at the wording of the question among the 12 questions. Oh, is this, I'm sorry, is this the one, another impact on national parks wasn't mentioned, air quality?
Yeah, so specifically, how is climate change affecting air quality or making it worse, especially in national parks?
Well, that isn't my area of research. However, one of the potential risks under climate change is an increase in ground level ozone from the increased temperature, and published research has found that is a hazard in many parks. But second, the questioner asks about wildfires, and that research that I showed you about carbon in California, we found that over 2/3 of the carbon emissions from wildlands came from the 6% of the land that burned. Now it's burning this backlog of fuel, but the particulates the particulates from smoke from catastrophic wildfires obviously has great negative health effects. And so that adaptation measure of using fire proactively can reduce the risks of catastrophic wildfire in the future, helping the ecosystem, but also helping human health.
Thank you, Patrick. I think we had a number of people who were very concerned about hearing about the interference with science. We have a question about what can we do to counter the attack on science? And I know, Teresa, you personally, I think, were the first person to lead us into backing the March on Science that happened a number of years ago, and I think really helped galvanize NPCA around standing up for science. And I know Ryan has played a strong role in that too. So I wonder, Ryan and Teresa, maybe you first, and maybe Ryan, like what are your thoughts on what we do to counter the attack on science?
Well, I think in everything we do and how we've been responding in our materials and what we've been raising, and having sessions like this Park Talk is really elevating science and elevating fact-based science that really drives the issues and the policies. And I'm really pleased that we certainly have been doing that, but we've also made sure that in our magazine, all of our materials, and every opportunity in social media we have to really promote the actual science around these issues, and particularly climate change, so that people understand. And I think we're hearing from a lot of our members, we're hearing from people that participate in these, and it's important that everybody take this information and share it with family, neighbors, friends, as many people as they can. I mean, we have to be able to get that message across, and we all have to work together to do that. And Ryan?
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you, Teresa. And I will add that, like you're seeing from Patrick's research, which is just incredible, is giving us data and information that we need at many levels, not simply just for this one particular topic that we're covering today, but it adds to a body of science. And this is global. There are other countries, there are other cultures, there are so many other policies and other institutions that rely on these data. And so it's really important that the data are transparent, that data are available from our federal agencies, that we have the ability, to see what is being generated. And that way, the access can really be very empowering for organizations like NPCA in this very example where we are showcasing the terrific research by Patrick. So I want to make sure that the science remains transparent and available to everyone.
Great. Thank you, Teresa and Ryan. This one I'm going to direct towards Ani, just to give you a heads up. Great question. We just had a significant victory with the Great Americans Outdoor Act. How do you see that factoring into our discussion this morning on climate change? What if any, help does that give us in addressing climate change challenges?
Great question. So for national parks, the Great American Outdoors Act is really directed at addressing the backlog. And one way we can look at that is our hope is that by addressing the backlog problem, which has really taken a lot of the attention of both our National Park Service as well as our administration and Congress, that has taken so much attention. Now that we've started to really address that major problem, it provides an opening for us to really pivot our attention to additional issues and problems within the National Park Service. It means really amplifying the needs of general operations. It means revisiting issues like amplifying and providing funding for science and support. It's hard when you have an issue as big as the backlog that has the total natural tendency to just suck all the air out of the room, because it's such a major and very present problem for people visiting our national parks and engaging with the parks, whether it's broken bathrooms, trails that are closed, etc. Address that and address sort of like this wound, and gives us an opportunity to pivot national attention to other issues. The other opportunity is, of course, in the funding for LWCF, the Land and Water Conservation Program, both stateside and federal funding that can be provided to increase green spaces around the nation, right? This provides us opportunities to consider funding and buying additional properties from willing sellers to improve our green spaces, both on the state side, locally, talking about your own local parks and playgrounds, but it also means looking at additional areas of potential support for expanding what is the portfolio of our nation's public lands, which obviously increasing just the base of our public lands provides us a greater opportunity to address climate change through carbon sequestration and other natural lands activities.
Great, thank you, Ani. I note that we are just about at time. We are saving all of the questions in the Q&A. If we did not get a chance to respond in person, we will make sure we follow up with answers and links and materials. And I just want to thank Dr. Gonzalez, Teresa, Ani, Ryan. This was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I learned a lot, and I hope that you all found this valuable. And Teresa, any last words from you?
Yeah, no, just again, we're so grateful, Dr. Gonzalez. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. And we will, as Mark said, share materials, and let's continue to work together for protecting our planet. particularly our national parks. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.